everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Lackawanna Pastimes. I'm Sarah Puccini, the Assistant Director at the Lackawanna Historical Society. Our featured presenter today is Amy Walsh. Amy is a fifth grade teacher with the Scranton School District and the author of several novels. Her nonprofit, West Mountain Publishing, specializes in publishing anthologies to raise money for both local and global charities. She and her husband Patrick love to spend free time investigating local history. Often, their research begins with items Patrick has found while metal detecting, as they track down the origins and attempt to return items of value to their original owners, or in most cases, the owners' families. Amy considers herself blessed with all the roles in which she has been gifted, including mother of three entertaining children, lover of family and friends, nature appreciator, tea aficionado, avid dessert fan, book fanatic, and Christ follower. Amy will be talking about the history of the West Mountain Sanitarium, focusing specifically on the 1930s, an era she researched for her upcoming book. So, Amy, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the introduction. The West Mountain area itself has become dear to me over the years, and the last 10 years or so, I've really become interested in the sanitarium. I became even more interested during the pandemic because I started writing novels and I started thinking of, people that had been ill over the centuries, and it just got me a little bit more interested in medical research. But I have two novels that I've written that have West Mountain Sanitarium as a setting. I'm going to start by talking about spelling a little bit, if I can get my screen to work. We have sanitarium, sanatorium, and sanatorium. And there is a little bit difference between the different connotations and the different spellings. Westsiders always call the place up on the mountain the sanitarium, and it's pretty much a North American word, whereas sanatorium and sanatorium are more global words. The sanitarium was always used for open air treatments and more spa-like treatments. It didn't really have medical treatments like surgeries and such until the hospital was built, and that would be called a sanatorium. So in my novel, I call it the West Mountain Sanatorium because I want the main character to show that she doesn't feel like she really fits in the area. But then whenever the locals are talking, they call it the sanitarium. And it was just a little device I used. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the background of tuberculosis before I go any further. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's a disease caused by bacteria that settles in the lungs, but it can settle in other organs as well, and even in the bones. There was no real cure until 1949. So if you contracted TB, you had to be isolated, and the mortality rate was 50%, which is huge. When you put into perspective, like the mortality rate of COVID when it first came was about 5%. So that was pretty significant. So of course, people were very fearful about contracting it. Prior to antibiotics, if the treatment worked, then it was often just a temporary thing, and it would just become dormant or go into almost an intermission or remission, and then it could return at any time. Throughout history, it's been known by other things like consumption, because it consumed the life out of the patient or victim little by little. It was called white plague because it made the patient so pale. And TB actually was a standard of beauty, believe it or not, in Victorian times. Women wanted to look like they had TB. They wanted to be thin and pale and weak. I guess they were very morbid at that time, but they called it the beautiful death. And TB actually changed fashion. It's the reason why women eventually had shorter dresses, because they didn't want their, the dresses to hit the ground and possibly pick up germs if people were spitting. And it's one of the reasons why even people that were more poverty stricken eventually had their children wear shoes. Children often went barefoot for centuries, but they started to wear shoes because of tuberculosis. Many articles claim tuberculosis has caused more deaths than any other infection in history. The World Health Organization estimates 1.8 people are infected with it even today. You could have TB and not even know it because it could lie dormant in your body. And then if you get weakened, your autoimmune goes, starts to weaken, it could become apparent. Before antibiotics, if a person didn't respond to treatment, like up on the West Mountain Sanitarium, then they would have an average of 3 years to live. I made a little timeline here. I have to move up my little grid. I made a timeline of some of the important things that happened up on the mountain at the sanitarium. In 1902, a hospital was proposed with blueprints by architect Robert Snyder. He volunteered his abilities, and he came up with the blueprint that you see that was published in the newspaper. The original site was 2,200 feet above sea level on the top of Bald Mount. And consumptives began camping in tents below Bald Mount on West Mountain before they even started building. Then in 1903, Dr. Wainwright, he banded together with the Scranton Society for the Prevention of Consumption, and they had land donated by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. And that's when the sanitarium was built. It was at that point about 1,600 feet above sea level. You have to remember that Scranton was double its size at that point in history, and it was just very, very smoggy. It was full of factories. It had the railroads with, the smoke from the railroads. The cars didn't really, they emitted a lot of fumes. And then we had coal fires all throughout the city. So during the winter, especially, or when there was a lot of humidity, it was hard for people with lung problems to breathe. Clicking to the next slide. So at first in 1903, it consisted of several bungalows built with donated materials. Volunteers from Scranton came up and different businesses contributed wood and such. And they built these, I think there were about 12 of them that they built for the consumptives, and they were called the Little Band of Consumptives. And every week they would report the increased weight of the consumptives. So they would literally come up, weigh them, and put them in the newspaper. And the community was proud of how they were treating the people with tuberculosis and how their donations were helping them to become healthy again. The Glen Alden Coal Company took on the reforestation project, and they planted 40,000 different kinds of pines. Pines were thought to purify the air. So whenever, wherever you were on the globe where they had sanitariums, you would see lots of pines and spruces. Then finally, the winter house was built, and that was called the Pavilion, and eventually the sanitarium. And architect Snyder's blueprints were modified to house more patients. So if you look, if you could compare this to the last slide, oops, I went the wrong way. It was longer, so more patients could fit in there. And then that same society that were helping people with consumption, they ran 2 clinics. They volunteered their time, and they actually put their lives on the line, to have free clinics. And they would meet them on Linden Street on Wednesday and Saturday nights. All throughout my research of the sanitarium, I just couldn't believe how willing people were to help other people get well. And in 1923, voters elected to change the sanitarium from private to county run. And, there was a lot of debate. Actually, for about 3 years, they debated it. And finally, in 1923, it was voted in. So, and then in 1925, the new hospital was built, and that had a capacity for 90 patients. It was open to the public for visits in October. And then by the end of October, it opened, and it was called the Lackawanna County Tuberculosis Hospital. It closed in June 1974. And mostly it was closed because their tuberculosis had pretty much been cured, and numbers of other lung ailments were dwindling, and other hospitals could help them. The air was cleaner by then, but it was still a beautiful property. And there was a lot of public debate over whether or not it should be used for, like a nursing home or some other kind of facility. They didn't want to put it to waste. But for whatever reason, nothing ever took off. Then in October of 1982, it was put up for a public auction, and Pete Sabia purchased the property. And it just kind of lay there stagnant for years and years. There were fires, big fires in 1985, 1994, 2002, and 2007. They were all considered caused by arsonists. It could have been partiers that were up there, and they weren't careful, but it was all things that shouldn't have happened. And honestly, it was dangerous. The people of the mountain were very upset because there's only one way in and one way out of West Mountain. So after it closed, it just lay in ruin and became a party place, especially for teens and young adults. In the 80s and 90s, much of the equipment was still in the hospital. The beds were still there, the lockers were there. Even there were old records and cabinets in the basement, which I find really hard to believe, but somebody took them at some point, and they're probably in somebody's home somewhere, I'm imagining. There were rumors of Satanists and spiritualists holding rituals there. And these are some pictures of me when I started investigating in 2011. The first picture on the left is me in front of the old stable wall, and then the other two are of me in the sanitarium. That was the building that was built in 1903. That was the building in best shape at that point because the hospital had been taken down pretty much by fires and really burned down. The land went up for auction in 2018. And in 2019, there's the article in the newspaper that I have over to the right. Joseph Harris was the owner, and he cleaned up the grounds. He made it safer. He filled in the holes, tore down all the dangerous parts. And you can see those tires pictured there. That was just a small portion of the tires that were dumped up there. If you had walked around the property, you would have seen all mattresses, you name it, like, a freezer or two. It just became a dumping ground. So Joe really put a lot of work into cleaning it up. And then he resold it, and the land was divided and resold to private owners. Now it's posted with no trespassing signs. There's cameras on the property, and it's monitored by the local, like Ransom Township, the Abington Police, and the state law enforcement. So they don't want visitors now. But in 2021, I did get permission to go up there and hold a photo shoot. So you can see my two models that were they modeled for me for my book cover and for marketing purposes. And a local photographer, Belinda Schindler, is the one that took all the pictures. You can find her work on pexels.com. She's a really good photographer, and all of her photos that are donated, they're donated on Pexels, and she has over 1 million views. So she's doing really well for herself. But my model that with the red hair is Tori, and her, I think it was a great grandmother. I know she had a relative or two who worked for the sanitarium, so I thought that was pretty neat. And then the other model is my daughter. So the picture on the left is of the old artesian well, and we think that was the first well that was drilled on the property. And that was below the hospital. But then eventually another well was drilled up on the mountain, and there was a well house, and that provided pressure even for a lot of Scranton because, of the gravity of the mountain. All right. There's nothing left of the hospital at all. It's been filled in with clean fill. And this fireplace is the only thing that's left of the original sanitarium building that was built in 1903, but that is still standing. For those who are interested in more about the history, there are 2 articles here that I really recommend. They have more specific timeline because I'm going to speak on more of where I researched for my book. And if you love to read about history, I highly recommend newspapers.com. I spend hours and hours and hours reading it. I read the old newspapers way more than I write because I find it just really highly addictive, actually. So I highly recommend you go on there and look up. I have a lot of clippings that you can look and read more on your own. Another 2 things that I think you would enjoy would be the JP videos. He has 2 really good videos of him going through at different time periods and seeing the ruins before they really were dismantled. And then there's a really good video from the Albright Library, or the Children's Library, on urban legends. And the librarian reads a nice little excerpt from a book on the West Mountain Sanitarium. A place that you can go physically is the community hall, the Ransom Community Center. It's an old schoolhouse, and all along the walls they have collages of photos and other memorabilia, so you can look and see the pictures firsthand. And then I have my own little private collection, and I took some pictures here of what I have. The first picture was actually taken by my son when he was 10. And if you squint your eyes up there, you can see a little face in the left-hand window. So I think that's kind of fun. It's a face made by foliage, but he always thought it was a little spooky. The gear in the middle is from one of those old push mowers before they had motors. Below that, you have the West Mountain Sanitarium pin, and that was used to raise money, for the patients. And a man who loves to study urban decay actually came up and he was exploring on his own, and he reached into the wall of the sanitarium and there was a whole bag of those, and then he sold them on eBay. The feather is a pendant. A railroad guy would love the watch that I have up there. That's a 1921 railroad watch that was found about 9 inches below the ground. And then we have a little car that was found, about a foot underground by the old playground area. My husband is a metal detector, and he's even more avid about local history than I am. So he's my research partner. And I wanted to show this because he found this class ring on the sanitarium property. And about 50 years after it had been lost up on the mountain, he was able to return it to Bob McGough's widow. I don't know if you remember Bob McGough. He was a Scranton councilman, really nice guy. And so the year, it was basically, I think the year exactly of his death that Pat was able to give that ring to his widow, and it just really perked her up at a hard time in her life. And so I was pretty proud of Pat for finding that ring and then tracking down the owner. Bob McGough had gone up on the mountain to the superintendent's house for some kind of celebration, and he lost it. And he had gone up there again and again trying to find it, and Pat found it 50 years later. So that's pretty cool. All right, now I'm going to focus on my actual research, which is the sanitarium during the Great Depression. So specifically 1931. And before I go any further, I'm so grateful for all the people that helped me with my research, from the Wayne County Historical Society to the Lackawanna County Historical Society, the Albright Memorial Library. I had lots of locals that I interviewed, and they were very helpful with donating pictures and stories. And then, of course, to my husband, who is my research partner. Let me just find where I am on my slides. Okay, so Voices in the Sanitarium goes back and forth between 2009 and 1931. And it is fiction. And mostly I think women are the ones that are going to want to read it because, it's the three main characters are women. But the historical parts are all based on real people that I found out about through my newspaper research and from interviewing locals about their relatives. And I tried my best to give them an honorable mention in my story to really get into their characters. And I really think they're all heroes. They went through a lot, and they really thought about others before themselves. I also want to acknowledge that the changes that happened in my own life and in my teaching life during COVID really got my interest in this story. While the beginning of the pandemic, I was teaching online, and my other 5th grade teachers and we tried everything we could to get the kids engaged and get them to come online. And we would drive from house to house to house, drop off prizes, drop off packets. And one thing we did is we went to actual places in the community and we did virtual tours. And one of the tours was at On and On. Has anybody here been to On and On? It's a warehouse of vintage and artisan and antique items. And that's where I go to find memorabilia sometimes. But anyway, Megan, who is one of the owners, she went on a tour with me, and my students were watching, and they asked questions afterwards. And a couple of the things that I saw on the tour actually were my muses for the story. One was a very strange doll that they call 11 because she looks like the character from Stranger Things. Sometimes she'll mysteriously topple over at night, I guess, and her wig would fall off. And so she looked like the character from Stranger Things. And then there was also an antique Victorian scrapbook, and it looked like a journal, and that kind of inspired the story as well. So I just think it's neat because way back in the 30s, the people of Scranton really cared about kids, and they really cared about sick people. And then, all these years later during the pandemic, we had people in the community that were doing so much for our kids to try to get them you know, they were trapped in their houses, but they didn't want them to feel like they were. And it was a really neat thing. This is the mood board that I used when I was writing. This would kind of, you know, put me in the spirit of the 1930s, and I would look at the different characters that I was writing about. And I'm going to kind of hone in on some of these images as I go on throughout the rest of my slideshow. This is the front of the hospital during the Great Depression. There was marble in the front facade, on the steps, and even in the interior. Later pictures have it brick. They took off the marble and they put the brick over the front entrance. So I think that's kind of interesting. The walls of the bathroom for visitors were even marble. And to the right are the airing porches. There were also porches on the back of the hospital. Here is the aerial view of the sanitarium. I think this was taken in 1929, so it's a little bit before my, whoops. Can you still hear me, everybody?
Yeah, you're good, Amy.
Okay. The very top, you see there's a little white blur. That was the schoolhouse. And then over here, this long line was the stable. You can see it was pretty large. They had quite a few horses because they had a lot of fields, and they had a sleigh. So they needed horses. They had cows and they had pigs as well. And they probably were housed there too, but they pretty much free ranged over the mountain. Like they just were able to go wherever they felt like. They had cure cottages. You can see they kind of look like loaves of bread up here. Up on here on the mountain are the chicken coops. This was the original sanitarium, the one that was built in 1903. I believe this is where the children were during this time, because they would move and relocate patients over the decades and depending on needs. And I believe this is where they were in 1931. And then down here is the actual hospital. So you can see how much larger it is than the original. Here down below was the orchard. There's basically apple trees all through here, all around, all throughout the mountain. There's blueberries throughout the mountain too. And most of them are planted by a man I'm going to tell you about later. And then the artesian well that I already mentioned. And all these were like activity fields and picnic grounds. And what's interesting is that you know, Scranton was overpopulated, really, when you think about it at that time period. And so they would, during their free time, they would hike up here, and they would, you know, spend their leisure time with picnics and activities. They had sports events up here, like they might have like a skeet shoe or an archery match. And they would have all kinds of meetings, whether it was Boy Scouts or I'm trying to think of other ones right now, but it was just a place that you wouldn't think was a hospital because it was more like a park. All right, so despite the prices rising with the ruined economy all across the country, I discovered that the Scranton area in general was in decent shape. I think we took better care of the poor than other places did. Like I said, they just a lot of goodness that happened here. And at the sanitarium, costs were cut per patient each year during the Great Depression. In 1931, the county provided 1.92 per patient each day. But you have to keep in mind that the hospital also had donations from the Christmas seals, campaigns, and other fundraisers. Also, the sanitarium was almost self-sufficient, which I'll explain more about later, but they had the cows, they had the chickens, they had a fish hatchery, they had an orchard, they had potato fields. So, and they even sold their surplus to the county prison to buy more materials that they needed. So they did a really good job of, you know, keeping themselves so that they could keep running and keep helping people. They did have to place yearly bids for milk and for coal, and also they had to pay the salaries of the staff. Here is a picture on the top of the mountain of one of the sanitarium horses, and we believe that these were patients. And you wouldn't really expect what the top of West Mountain looks like because there are just giant flat fields, and that's where they had the potato crops. And The sanitarium patients were encouraged to stay active if they were in the ambulant category. So they would actually be given chores to do, and they would be expected to get exercises to strengthen their lungs. There were 3 different categories of patients. They had hospital or acute patients, and they very rarely left their beds. So they would actually stay in their beds pretty much all day long, and they would wheel their actual beds outside onto the porches, which is kind of hard to think about. They must have had a pretty big elevator. Then they had the semi-ambulant patients. They could basically walk to the bathroom or, maybe walk to the cafeteria to eat, but they had to stay in bed almost all the time. They had to semi-recline. They weren't even allowed to sit up straight. And they had to be outside almost all the time, even no matter if it was freezing temperatures, they were outside. Of course, the ambulant, those that could walk had the greatest chance of recovery, and they could live a normal, active life, but they still had to be segregated from the rest of society because they were contagious. Here are 2 of the chicken coops. So you can see that they had a lot of chickens. So they had lots of eggs and chicken dinners, I would say. These coops were still standing. They were so well built that they were still standing just a couple years ago, and they were finally torn down. So I'm going to focus on some interesting characters in the next few slides. Some of these here are workers and their family members, and some of these are mentioned in my novel Voices. Here is one of my favorites, Teresa de la Plante. She was the first superintendent of the sanitarium, and she's kind of a mystery because I can't really find out much about her personal life. She came from Montreal to go to the Scranton Private Hospital Training School, and she graduated in 1911. And she had such an eclectic repertoire of skills. She was an RN, but she managed the hospital. She wrote grants. She held medical seminars. She was a spokesperson at those seminars. She managed the school children's curriculum. She was a party planner. I couldn't find her obituary, though I did find her brother's in a Canadian newspaper. But a lot of times her name was misspelled in the newspaper, and sometimes she was called Laura, sometimes she was called Mary. So it's kind of almost like she was behind the scenes all the time, doing so much, but not really looking for credit for it, which I think is pretty neat. She was the superintendent for 30 years before she fell ill, and then Mr. Rainey replaced her. This is a photo that was discovered amongst other sanitarium photos from the 1930s by a local historian, and we think that this is the inside of the superintendent's home. Teresa de la Plante, had to host many political gatherings with local and state politicians and businessmen in an attempt to get more funding. And I imagined while I was reading the book that she was the lady that's standing to the right in the white coat, but I'm not sure. But yeah, she was really a neat person. Here's another one that I really, enjoyed learning about, Dr. Wheelock. He succeeded the original presiding doctor, who was Dr. Rainwhite, and he was a World War II hero. In June of 1931, the West Mountain Hospital had the capacity for 150 patients, 30 of them were children. It appears that right after Dr. Wheelock returned from a cross-state tour of other sanatoriums, it was announced that all patients admitted to West Mountain had to be advanced or incipient cases, no more ambulant cases. So they only wanted to admit those that were more severe. And no one could be admitted to the mountain unless they were first examined at the State Tuberculosis Clinic, which was on 331 Adams Avenue. At that time, citizens were so frantic about how TB was spreading that X-ray vans were going from neighborhood to neighborhood, and it was mandatory for entire families to be screened. And if a patient breathed or moved during the process, there could be shadows that looked like TB. I also found evidence to believe that Dr. Wheelock made this move to keep healthier individuals from being placed at the sanatorium due to political maneuvers. So it was such a beautiful place, and it was such a well-respected place that there was a waiting list. And I also think he might have been trying to keep himself from being tempted to use patients that might not have had it to help on the mountain, because there was a labor shortage. There weren't a lot of people that wanted to work with people that had TB. So I think he was in a hard position. Dr. Wheelock was truly a hero, both in World War I and on the medical front. He was passionate and determined about saving lives. He did what he had to do to keep his patients alive during a time when even family members would reject those with TB. There was some hush hush about his removal from his position as county director. I think it was probably political. There were editorials demanding that he remain because he just was well respected in the community. But he went on to work for the state of Pennsylvania, and I think his position there was even more prestigious. I believe he literally gave his life to the cause of lung disease. He collapsed with a heart attack, and then just a few days later, after getting out of the hospital, he went right back to work, and he collapsed again and died instantly right in the clinic. So, you know, he was gung-ho about helping people with lung disease. There were about 25 to 29 children at the sanitarium in 1931. Some were bedridden, others went to the schoolhouse for 3 hours in the morning, they rested in the afternoon, and then went back to the schoolhouse for an hour or two in the afternoon. I believe the children slept in the sanitarium building, which had no insulation. So if it got below a certain temperature, they would have had to be relocated, but for the most part, they, you know, slept no matter how cold they were. You have to keep in mind that in other parts of the nation, they didn't even have a sanitarium building. There were camps all across the nation, and you can see old pictures of people in tents in the middle of blizzards. Like they were surrounded by snow, and they're sitting out in the cold in camps that were outside of cities, almost like leper colonies, really. Oh, whoops. My 1931 character, Bridget, is modeled after a teen girl who stayed in the sanatorium in 1931. I interviewed her great nephew, and he told me some really neat stories about her. She and her siblings were orphaned, and Dr. Wheelock allowed her to check on them regularly because she lived down in Kaiser Valley, so it was a walkable distance from the hospital. So she would walk down the mountain and walk back up pretty regularly and stay there at night. He would have her work on the front desk, greeting visitors, and she also helped in the school with the school children. And then years later, her doctor went in and did x-rays and such and found no sign of her ever having had TB. So that was kind of a little mysterious, and I used that as a mini mystery in my book. To the left is a patient in the hospital itself. We believe the children to the right are also sanitarium patients. The landscape on West Mountain would look so different from what it is today because it was farms. It was all farmland. And then, you know, we had the pine trees, but they weren't really that high. So anyway, at the bottom is a Search for Maloney article. And this is a little boy who was a sanitarium patient, and he ran off one day and they couldn't find him anywhere. And they were looking and looking. He was 7 years old. And then the newspaper never reports him making it back. So I was like, what's going on here? But 3 years later, I did find an article in the newspaper where he had won a swimming contest. So it was a happy ending for Robert. Here is another one of my favorite characters, Bart Gilroy. He was the head of maintenance for the hospital. He immigrated at the turn of the century to work on the railroad. But, you know, having come from Ireland, he was used to farming and country life, and he just couldn't stand being in the city. So he'd always hike on his free time. And one day he hiked from the other side of West Mountain over Bald Mount and down towards the sanitarium grounds. And at the very moment, one of the sanitarium workers had just been mildly injured. I think he was had a horse and a wagon, and something had run over his foot or something. And he was kind of having a little fit, saying how much he hated working and farming. And Bart happened to be crossing the field right at that moment, and he volunteered to take a spot, and it worked out for him. They hired him on the spot, and he went on to work for the sanitarium for 50 years. He was only making $1.50 a day when he first started. But think about this, when there weren't enough donations to accept a new patient to the hospital, he would give up his salary, his daily salary, so that the superintendent would take that patient. $1.50 doesn't sound like much, but think about the fact that in Ireland at that time, they were making about $15 a year. So $1.50 a day probably seemed like a lot to him. I'm astounded at all Bart accomplished at the hospital and all the sacrifices he made. He was determined to keep the patients safe and healthy. He was an ingenious caretaker, and his occupation became his passion. I uncovered things I never thought of, such as how he and his workers used the ashes from heating the hospital to keep the roads safe during the winter, prior to plow trucks. I found an article showing him with record-breaking potatoes being grown on the sanitarium. One was a photo with a potato the size of his head that he was holding up next to his face. He sold free-ranging hogs to the county prison to purchase playground equipment. He designed the railings on all the paths and roads throughout the sanitarium using iron pipes, and he whitewashed them every spring. He made sure the orchards were planted and the fish hatchery was stocked and so much more. So he's a really neat guy. The boy in the photo to the left is Bart Gilroy's nephew. We call him Butch on West Mountain. He spoke with me many times relating information about his uncle and about West Mountain history. That picture was taken in the 50s, but I wanted you to see it because that's what the stable looked like on the outside. And you can see how well it was taken care of. It was a beautiful, beautiful building. To the right is a heartwarming tribute to Bart Gilroy from the Scrantonian Tribune. It was published on March 15th, 1959, and written about his retirement from the West Mountain Sanitarium after 50 years of service. He was just an incredible human being. So it was really my honor to give him a little shout out in my book. Here are some more sanitarium workers, cooks, maids, possibly the matron, and the maintenance workers. Bart is the man on the top right, and his wife Edie is on his right. Bart and Edie met at the sanitarium. She started working as a young teen. I think she was 14 years old when she started working at the hospital, and she would walk up the mountain every day. And she worked in the kitchen as an assistant cook, and then she also was a maid in the superintendent's house. There are numerous mentions of Edie throughout her name was Edith. But she did a lot for the community all throughout her life, and she had political and humanitarian efforts over the years. So she was a very neat person too. And here is our most famous sanitarium patient, Richard B. Smith, writer of Winter Wonderland, AKA Dick Smith. He was described as a tall, handsome chap in the Memphis commercial appeal in 1934. At the time, he had only one lung and was living on the 6th floor of a New York City high-rise. There's controversy over the exact time period he lived on West Mountain, over where he died, over what exactly inspired his famous song, Winter Wonderland, and even over what his middle name is, because there's different things in different newspapers and different interviews. But Dick was an avid writer and musician before he came to West Mountain. He was probably already a local celebrity in Honesdale before he even wrote his breakout song, because he worked in theaters all over the country in the big cities. And he also was very accomplished at Penn State. He was always in the newspaper for the things that he was doing while he was at Penn State as a student. But it appears that tuberculosis and his times of isolation on West Mountain is what gave his writing the depth and appeal it had to go further. Maybe it's just that he had time to finally write. An article written years after his death described him as a happy person who maintained his courage and supported himself and his wife by winning national slogan contests. And I did find some of the different slogans that he wrote to win contests. There were contests all the time in the newspaper in those days. And one of them was for Maybelline, and it was the eyes have it. So it was kind of like a pun. And that was in all the magazines at that time. It's kind of cute. In 1931, these spruces had just been planted along the drive to the superintendent's home, and Richard was battling tuberculosis with all his might while entering every single writing contest he could to support his stay on West Mountain. And devastated that her new husband was so ill, Richard's wife became a nurse at the sanitarium so she could be near him. They were married less than a year before he got sick. So that must have been a terrible time for his poor wife. After his death, she went on to remarry and live a long life. It was a rich life, according to her obituary. She married a vaudeville and film actor, Al Trehan. And during their marriage, they spent time in New York and Europe. And she died in Clark's Green in 1986, and she was survived by a son, 4 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. So I'm glad that she was able to go on and live a good life. Dick wrote a few songs that were popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. These are all songs that I have in my collection. The most haunting song he wrote is When a Gypsy Makes His Violin Cry. It's still performed today, most often as an instrumental. And you can hear my daughter, if you go on Facebook, you can hear my daughter playing it for the launch of Voices. You can just look up Voices in the Sanitarium and you'll eventually find it. That song was used to raise a lot of money for the Hungarian efforts, for the Hungarian Relief Fund in the 50s. So 20 years after his death, this song was helping people, on the other side of the world practically. So I think that's pretty neat. I admit that I did cry a few times while imagining the end of Richard Smith's life. He had so much to hope for. He thought he was cured when he left West Mountain. One of his lungs had been collapsed, like I said before, and that was a treatment to prevent the spread of TB. So basically they figured they trapped the TB in the collapsed lung and it wouldn't spread anywhere else on his body. And so he and his wife moved to Brooklyn, and he was contracted to work with a group of professional and famous musicians. And, he had more songs in the works than the ones that were even published, but then he passed away. He died just 3 or 4 years after he left West Mountain. You can see his family homestead in Honesdale, along with perusing a nice file on his life at the Wayne County Historical Society Museum. And Peter Becker, who is from Wayne County, wrote a nice little book about his life. It's called The Heritage of Dick Smith's Winter Wonderland. So you can grab a copy if you want to drive up there and get it at the museum. It's pretty interesting. There were so many sources of inspiration for Winter Wonderland at West Mountain in 1931, from the brave patients who chose laughter over fear, the Christmas Seal campaign, the festivities provided by loving citizens. So I want to end my talk today about talking about Christmas in the sanitarium in 1931, because it's my favorite part of sanitarium life. I just think about how hard it must have been in the 1930s, even harder than we can imagine with all our modern day appliances and such. But there were so many health hardships back then, and there were tragedies like mining deaths, and there was just so many things to be sad about. But yet the community banded together to give, the whole December was just full of festivities that were, created by the people of Scranton and the other communities surrounding Scranton. One source of funds and they were 1931 stamped like Iceland. All throughout December, different groups entertained the sanitarium patients. There were singers, small bands, orchestras. There were skits performed and a Christmas pageant. A volunteer dressed up like Santa to distribute gifts. The proceeds of entire performances by theatrical groups were donated to the hospital. So think about that. Like every member of those groups were willing to donate, a night's work to help those patients. Beauty parlors sent their workers up the mountain. So we have, beauticians coming up from the city to do the patient's hair. Children's organizations made scrapbooks for the kids. There were work nights scheduled in town, in Scranton, and men from the community got together and they took all the toys that had been donated. If they were, used toys, they would repaint them and fix them up, make them as good as new, and then donate them to the kids. And then, of course, they had feasts and fruits and candies also provided by the community. So a generous place. These are actually some pictures from 1931 magazines. This is a scrapbook that I purchased just because I wanted to see what kind of things the kids were doing back then. Illustrations in color were still a marvel at this time. And it was the habit of most families from the Victorian ages all the way up to the 1940s to cut out the illustrations and put them in a scrapbook. So that's why there's so many scrapbooks available from the era. So area children and scouts and other kids organizations made scrapbooks and donated them to the kids for Christmas. This is something that I find funny as well. Guess what else was donated to the patients that had lung disease? Lucky Strikes. One of the guys that I interviewed told me that the patients on the mountain smoked Lucky Strikes like all day, like 24/7. And it seems ironic that they were smoking cigarettes, but look at the advertisement. Your throat protection against irritation, against cough. So, you know, coughing is one of the worst parts of having TB, and somehow it was the cough suppressant. And I have to point out too, even the kids, like even the children were smoking these all day long. All right, some secondhand magazines were also collected from community members. They had drop-off boxes. So items like these were distributed to other institutions in the community as well, like the Ransom Poor Farm, which I would like to write a book about that someday too. Very interesting place. Believe it or not, the serial novels that were regularly published in the Times and Tribune were also regifted to patients. So just like in Victorian times, they had serial novels. They had serial novels at this time as well in Scranton. And so they would cut out, you know, the weekly next part of the story and put it in a binder or some sort, and they were donated. And then of course we have the dime novels. So they would love the dime novels. I wanted to point out too, like we take paper so for granted nowadays, but in this time they were still using every part of the newspaper. They were wrapping food in newspaper. They didn't really have saran wrap or anything like that yet. And they would wrap their packages, you know, especially if you didn't have the money to buy wrapping paper. It was your wrapping paper, but it was also used as toilet paper. So I'd cut whatever they didn't want into strips, and that was their toilet paper. Okay. So I'm nearing the end of my talk, and I have this big question that everybody asks: is the West Mountain Sanitarium haunted? So some people think it is, some people think it's not. I talked to quite a few people about their experiences on West Mountain who swear that they had strange experiences after it was already closed. Some heard voices, some saw strange lights. Some are convinced that there's ghosts or demonic forces. But the funny thing is, mostly all of those people admitted to be up there they were partying, you know, so they're drinking and doing who knows what. So you have to be, you know, take everything with a little grain of salt. But there's also people who exercise there, they hunted there, and now live up there, and they all say that they've only felt peace there. That it's a bright place with all sorts of beautiful sightings, from sunrises to wildflowers, butterflies, hummingbirds, deer, other wildlife. And yes, people died there, but from my research, there were many who were healed as well. In fact, there were so many more healed than the national average, and compared to other hospitals, that doctors from all around the world came to learn from our doctors and nurses here. So yeah, I think it was a place of hope compared to other places people were going to be treated. It was a place where people from different nationalities who still lived in separate parts of the city. Don't forget, you know, there are different parts of the city for the Italians, different parts for the Irish and the Polish. And so they're all coming together in one institution. And at that time, they weren't really intermarrying that much yet either. So it was kind of a real melting pot on the mountain. They also had a rotation of different ministers from different denominations and walks of faith that held chapel services. So, you know, they had all kinds of learning about each other's traditions and cultures. From what I read about the sanitarium in the 30s, it was a place of hope and a place of peace for both the patients who survived, and it was for hope and peace for the patients who did not survive. And I love how a patient described it. She was a patient in 1925 and 1926. So I want to end with talking about this poem that she wrote. West Mountain Sanitarium, a home for the sick and weak, where the sun shines bright from morn till night, and the ill find what they seek. West Mountain Sanitarium upon a hill so high, where the air is pure and the cure is sure, where the moonlight makes you sigh. The place of health and cheer, and rose-colored west, where the sun sinks to rest, when the shades of eve appear. And those that have passed away, in memory dear, doth seem so near, in my mind have come to stay. And those that remain behind are dear to my heart, of my life they're a part, and the cure that we hope to find. West Mountain Sanitarium, where the snowbanks piled so high, the old cure chairs and the trees so bare, and the cold that would make you cry. And the wonderful view below, and the gorgeous sunrise in the far eastern sky, where the rich and the poor can go. And the beds on the porch each day, where the cows wander far because of no bars, and the cocks crow the night away. West Mountain Sanitarium, where the sweet spring breezes blow, the old locker room, waiting dinner at noon, where the dishwasher rattled so, and the windows down so low, the snow on your bed, and the wind on your head, no one but the sand people know. West Mountain Sanitarium and 6 cups of milk a day, the times that we had would make you feel sad when your thoughts to memory stray. West Mountain Sanitarium, a home for the young and old, where you breathe fresh air, and the food which is fair, and the moon is a ball of gold. By Mabel Lewis Clark, a SAN patient of 1925 and 26. So if any of you are interested in learning more about the sanitarium or other places in the community, you can just look up my name. You can Google my name, Amy Lynn Walsh, author, and you'll end up running into my blog and different Facebook groups that I operate. The novel that I just finished writing that's coming out in February, it talks about the sanitarium, Woolworths, the Globe, local theaters, the Actors League, the Women's Institute. And so I'll be having different things on my blog about those different components of my book. And so you can learn more about history of the Scranton area. All right, do we have any questions?
Thanks very much, Amy. That was excellent.
Oh, thanks.
I'm gonna stop your sharing.
Okay.
Let me hang on. There we go. I had to get back to my correct Zoom here. I'm glad your timeline talked about like the more recent history of the sanitarium. Like in my head, I can't reconcile a tuberculosis hospital existing much past the Victorian era. So the fact that there were still patients and they were still going in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s.
Yeah, 70s,
is
yes.
wild to me. I said I'm picturing consumptive Victorian heroines and not people.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you kind of brought the history up to date.
Yes, and you have to remember the miners, like the black lung was so common and we had so many miners in the area, so it was still needed.
Sure. I like the idea of the grounds were used as a public park rather than just a hospital, someplace you had to stay away from. It was a public place to go and to be enjoyed. Does anyone have any questions? There's a few minutes if anyone has a question to chime in.
I don't have a question, but I have to say it was extremely interesting on my part. And my mother always mentioned she had a second cousin to me, who had TB and was in the sanitarium there. And he would write to my mother. We were living in Jersey, and I would read his letters, Tony Pernobi. Wow. And it was so heartwarming, but sad. I was very young. And to think someone was confined forever to a hospital, and he did die there of it. But just seeing it, I was amazed how large the hospital is. I was thinking of this small little place on a mountain someplace. So it was very informative, but I couldn't help but think of this gentleman who I never met, and he was in
That's really neat though. I think they did a lot of writing in their free time, even if you weren't trying to enter contests. It was something to kill the time while you're stuck.
Yes, the time, and then probably release some of the tension and fear of their illness, knowing that they may not make it. And he was in his early 20s. I don't know why I think about 22 when he died, but at any rate, it was so. I really enjoyed what you had to
thank you.
Give us and just brought a lot of memories together, but I was fascinated on all that you said. I didn't realize what took place and,
Yeah,
you know, the whole thing. But thank you. It was
it
really
is very
interesting.
fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
I
Anybody
have a
else?
question,
Yeah,
and I
David.
wonder,
Amy,
do you know where the records for the hospital went when it was
No,
closed
that's a mystery to me.
in the 70s?
Yeah,
No.
I couldn't figure it out. I know that there were the early records were still on the bottom, and a few different people that I talked to said they couldn't believe they were like strewn out on the basement floor, like the old file folders and everything. And then at some point, somebody must have come in and collected them, and I have no idea where they went.
Too
I'm sure
bad.
the more modern day ones were taken, you know, when the hospital closed, but it was the older ones that were in this room in the back of the basement, and maybe didn't even remember that that room was back there, you know.
Amy,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't sound like there was any difference in treatment between the black lung people and the TB people. Sounds like they're intermixed in the cottages.
Yes.
Mhm.
I was surprised in my research that there wasn't more of a quarantining kind of thing.
Yeah,
Because I would think TB is contagious, whereas black lung is not. You know, black lung is basically the coal dust has made like almost a cement in your lungs. So there's no way to get that out. So
but if
black
you had,
lung, there was
but if you had
no
TB
cure.
on top of it, though, it was even
Yeah.
worse. Yeah,
Mhm. Yes,
but
exactly.
were they allowed visitors?
Yes. And like even I said, like the beauticians came up and did their hair, you know, and they didn't mask. So, you know, it's pretty incredible. But
Thank
I
you.
mean, TB was known as an illness you would get if you are weak. Okay, so one of the things that happened in the parks up there, the parents would tell their kids after school, walk up the mountain, and they would make them walk up the mountain just to, you know, exercise their lungs and get some fresh air. So, you know, there would have been little kids like you wouldn't imagine, like probably 3-year-olds walking up the mountain, you know, to get fresh air. They walked everywhere back then.
Mhm.
Amy, when you're saying West Mountain, are we talking off Newton Ransom Road? That it was
Yeah,
located?
like if you go up Jackson Street, and if you went up Jackson Street on the other side of Kaiser and just look straight up, that would be West Mountain.
Up there, okay.
Thank you again, Amy, for joining us, and everyone else for tuning in. Our next Lackawanna Pastimes episode, we'll be looking at local history resources that are available that you may not know of. Many of you know what's available in the Lackawanna Historical Society's collection and Lackawanna County Libraries. But next month, we'll be joined by Michael Nees, the Special Collections Librarian at the University of Scranton, who'll be focusing on digital and print resources the library has in their collection to focus on local history. There are photo collections, manuscripts, documents, things like that, that may be able to provide you with additional resources for your research if you're looking into family history or just into local history. This might be resources that you weren't aware that existed. So we're happy to bring Michael in and have him open up his collections to the public so you know a little bit more about what's available. Thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely weekend, everyone.